You're watching GBC's Viewpoint. Irish lawyer Caroline Simmons was very critical of the new law that's been put to referendum, in particular the provision for women to access an abortion on the grounds that continuing with the pregnancy would affect her mental health.
Well, I suppose the first thing I would say is that it's very important that everybody voting on an issue as important as this, that they will find out what exactly is involved and what is necessary. Are women in Gibraltar getting adequate and proper health care in pregnancy? Are they being looked after for the complications that might occur? If there are interventions that have to be made, is it legal to make them? And my understanding of the law here is that it is exactly the law that pertained in Ireland, all coming from a very old English Act which applied to both of our jurisdictions. And it is that we can look after women in pregnancy, but doctors are not allowed to deliberately end the life of an unborn child. However, sometimes there are complications in pregnancy. I know this myself, I've had one with my first child. There are complications which may require that you end a pregnancy early, and sometimes so early that the baby will quite likely or most clearly not survive. But in order to save the mother's life, an intervention has to be made. And in those circumstances, doctors have always been allowed to intervene. So women in Gibraltar need be no more fearful than we were in Ireland. Unless a doctor is negligent, and that can happen if they're dealing with any aspect of medicine, not just maternity care. Unless a doctor is negligent, any illness or complication in pregnancy a woman has will be dealt with by their doctors, whether it's anything from cancer to having to deliver a baby early. And the other experience I would bring to bear is just looking at the nature of the act which your people are now being asked to vote on. What exactly is it going to change in medical practice here? And I have read, some suggestions that it's going to allow abortion in very restricted circumstances and only in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. But if anybody actually picks up the Act and reads it, you'll see that that's not the case. There is one situation in which there's a time limit of 12 weeks out of 4, but in the 4 other cases where abortion is allowed, there is no time limit.
The 3 others, no?
3 others, I beg your pardon, you're right. And when there is no time limit prescribed, then in those cases, abortions can occur throughout 9 months of pregnancy. And most reasonable people, would not want to see abortions throughout 9 months of pregnancy. And if you want to rule out the possibility of late-term abortions, then you cannot vote yes on the 19th of March.
You don't think there should be any mental health scenario in which that is used as a justification for an abortion?
If a person suffers from a mental health condition, how is it normally looked after?
Through mental health care.
Exactly. And when did abortion become a necessary part of mental health care?
If you don't mind, I would prefer to ask you the questions.
Yes, well, I'm not a doctor, but there is no data out there. There is, in fact, it's very interesting, in the world medical literature, and please ask obstetricians. Eileen Riley was speaking yesterday at the conference. She would be somebody to speak to. There is no data that shows that abortion is a proper part of psychiatric care. It never has been. And the idea that it would be, used as care, as I've said, mental health is the open door to abortion on demand. You can have a situation where a woman will say when she's 5 or 6 months or at any stage during her pregnancy, if I don't have an abortion, I'm going to commit suicide. And in that case, rather than looking after her suicidal ideation, the doctor is now going to be asked to terminate the baby's life. So for the first time in Gibraltar, doctors will be asked to perform abortions on medically, physically healthy women and very probably physically healthy babies. Do people in Gibraltar really want that? In the absence of medical evidence that it is a necessary and appropriate way.
So in short, you don't think that there should be an exception in Gibraltar law that allows for a medical professional to make an assessment and decide that an abortion is justified on mental health grounds?
Mental health grounds are the most abused ground in any legislation for abortion anywhere in the world. If you want to allow abortion on demand, this is the way that you do it. And in your legislation, you aren't even requiring that the medical practitioners who are certifying a woman for abortion have any expertise in the area of mental health. nor are you requiring that they have any expertise in the area of fatal fetal abnormalities.
But would
Those
you,
things are required in the Irish legislation.
but would you seek to fine-tune that point,
No.
or you'd want it scrapped?
No, I think women want to be looked after. It has never been shown that abortion is necessary to address any mental health issue in pregnancy. Why then would you look for abortion? It's not appropriate. It's not an appropriate method of treatment. You don't bring people to mental health hospitals. You know, this is not how you treat an illness of that type, I understand. And the one thing that we have been told by psychiatrists is when somebody is suffering from suicidal ideation or tendencies, the one thing you don't do is make permanent decisions for them. They're told not to make sudden decisions, that this is a process that is very gently and carefully dealt with. And what you're proposing is a very, is a violation of a woman in a very distressed situation and something that she might come to regret. So this has been the experience we've had in Ireland. But the one thing another thing I would like to emphasise to people is, if you look to the UK, our nearest neighbour, and yours in terms of law as well, in the UK, in 2018, there were over 205,000 abortions. Of that number, 96% were allowed on the ground of a risk to the physical or mental health of a woman who's pregnant. Of that figure, 99.9% of those abortions, over 196,000, took place on the basis of a risk to her mental health. It is the open door. It is the abortion on demand. And it doesn't matter how you dress it up. That is the impact on a society, and that will be the impact on the society here. It makes abortion much more prevalent, and I don't think that's...
How do we know that it makes it much more prevalent?
Well, we can look at the statistics in Ireland, of what is happening here. We're beginning to see some of the figures. It's more prevalent because it's more easy to get. If this is the easiest ground that a person can get an abortion on, then this is what they will do. You have got a 12-week situation as well. Abortion allowed in 12 weeks, in the first 12 weeks, where there is a risk greater than if the pregnancy was terminated to the physical or mental health of the woman. The 12-week period is a very interesting one, and one could ask, why is it 12 weeks? And I'm sure, will have politicians who will say, well, we're not allowing abortion for disability. We're not allowing the abortion of children with Down syndrome. We're only dealing with children with fatal fetal abnormalities. Well, let me tell you that testing which is done now at about 9 or 10 weeks of pregnancy will indicate with a very high degree of certainty the risk of a baby having a fatal fetal abnormality. It will also indicate a risk of a baby having a condition like Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis. And Down syndrome is not a fatal fetal abnormality, but because it can be picked up at this early stage, a lot of women, and in fact we know in England 90% of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. So this isn't the bill that people want. If they want to limit abortions in any situation to less than 9 months of pregnancy, they have to vote no. If they think that allowing it on a broad basis such as this, for mental health reasons, taking into account foreseeable environment and vague suggestions like that, then they can't vote yes. They will have to demand more specificity from their government, and they will have to think about having another referendum. And let's face it, there's nothing wrong with consulting people. The Swiss do it all the time. All the time. We have had many referenda on abortions in Ireland, and we have, had to consider evidence given from abroad in Ireland throughout very, very many years. I'm sure this is as important an issue to the people of Gibraltar, to the doctors and nurses working in healthcare in Gibraltar, that they will want to think very carefully about it. They want to think very carefully about the fact, for instance, that in this Act, doctors and nurses are required to prove their conscientious objection. How do you do that? What is required? Do they have to have some faith basis? Do they have to have some moral basis? Do they have to have some medical literature researched? What's the government requiring there? And is it going to become a requirement of working in obstetric care that doctors and nurses will be required to work in this area? We have seen in Ireland, since the Act became law, that we have seen advertisements for positions of obstetricians in our national maternity hospital where abortion is one of the duties of the job. And the language is even being changed. They're calling it now abortion care. Well, in my view, this is the only procedure in a doctor's arsenal of medical care which requires the intentional destruction of a human life. It isn't required otherwise.
Gibraltar is set to vote on whether the Crimes Amendment Act 2019, that defines the circumstances which would allow abortion in Gibraltar, should come into force. Effectively, people will be asked to vote yes, we want to change the law to allow abortions, or no, we don't. An alliance called Gibraltar for Yes has also launched. Viewpoint will be sitting down with them to understand their perspective in the coming weeks.